Welcome to the 100th episode of Tales from Korea, the channel that brings you various ghost, mystery, paranormal, and in general bizarre stories fresh from Korean web communities. It's been almost 2 years now. What started as a minor plan B when my course of life was hit by all the recent historic events still remains on the ground, but there's something that keeps me going. Having a little creative outlet, a sense of responsibility to produce something week by week, and of course people like you coming by and giving me a word of encouragement all mean that something to me. So here still I am making my 100th video. This will be a compilation episode of my particular favorite stories from the past episode 51 to 99. I hope you all join this little celebration and enjoy various stories that covers topics from weird dreams to possession and exorcism to curse and cleansing to real-life crime and encounters with psychotic people to Korean tradition and mythology. As always, handpicked, translated and narrated by yours truly, Anthony. I'm a man now in my 40s, and here I want to finally talk about what I experienced more than 20 years ago on an island I visited. I've never talked about it to anyone so far, but now that my father has passed, I figured it was time to recount before too late. I was a rebellious teenager then, but was excited for my dad's proposal to make a summer holiday on an island, a holiday for us 3 guys, including his younger brother. We arrived at a small port in Kohung on the southern coast. There we met up a boat owner who was said to be my dad's acquaintance. He took us to a small island untouched by usual holiday makers. The journey must have taken us a good 1 hour. I still vividly remember the horrible seasick I suffered on the way. The first impression of the island was a bit disappointing. There wasn't even a proper wharf, and the boat berthed at a rock formation whose natural shape landed itself as a crude wharf. The captain explained that there were now only about 50 people left on the island, all his own family and relatives in one way or the other. Just off the shore, the first odd thing I noticed was there were lots of stone walls as tall as a grown-up man. But once past walls, it looked like a typical quaint countryside village. Meanwhile, the captain was telling us that we should never venture out once the sun set, and not to mind the weird noises we might get to hear as they were just wind blowing through the stone walls. It only triggered my curiosity, but I soon forgot it all once we hit the beach. The sandy beach was empty except for 2 men who introduced themselves as the relatives of other villager. We got along quickly, and we all had a fabulous time, swimming, sharing food, carefreely running along the empty beach. As the sun started setting, my dad, who didn't enjoy drinking, suggested that we should all now go back, as we might catch a cold in the night sea wind. Indeed, the tide was coming in to the spot where we settled, and wind was getting wilder. I don't know if it's my false memory, but I think it was also about then I started hearing a strange metallic noise. But the other 2 guys, having opened their cans of beer, insisted staying behind a while longer. In the end, just us 3 took our way back to the village. Dad seemed still worried about the guys, to which Uncle asked if we should go back to take them back, while I was so tired and couldn't think anything much. And then we heard screams from the beach side. We looked at each other's surprised faces a while. Uncle volunteered he would run down to check on them and that Dad and I would be better going ahead. We nevertheless waited on the spot. Time just passed on without any further signs and none showing up. I asked Dad if we too shouldn't go to the beach to search for them, to which Dad quietly pushed on our way back to the village. Dad said he should talk to the captain and I should stay in the room. Frustrated and curious in equal measure, I sneaked out and eavesdropped their conversation. They were talking about what they referred as the Demon Ghoul. The captain's wife was saying that they must have been lured by the Demon Ghoul and they should wait till the morning before we could go searching. Seeing Dad not protesting to that, he too seemed to have already heard about the Demon Ghoul. I got mad to find out that they had no intention to rescue Uncle right away. I sneaked out by myself and ran down towards the stone walls. As my momentary courage out of fury subsiding quickly, all my senses became hyperactive like a little field rat sensing the near presence of an eagle. That strange noise was coming from the other side of the wall, which sounded like a mixture of a hiss of a snake and a wheezing of an asthma patient. I told myself it was just wind and carried on walking along the wall. But it didn't take long to realize the noise would continue even when the wind or wave died down. And then I heard something scratching on the wall. I froze still, and through the crack of stones I saw a black figure on the other side. Something snapped in me, and all I can remember afterwards is that I rushed back to the captain's house, screaming all the way. The whole night I shivered under the blanket, trying to dismiss the noise of the Demon Ghoul in vain. Next morning, wind and wave turned mild, and there was no trace of the noise, as if everything of the night before was but a dream. The captain's wife joined my dad and I to the beach, but there was no trace of my uncle or the two guys, not even their footsteps. The wife sighed and said that the Demon Ghoul must have got them. According to her, in the island was always the story about the demonic monster that looked like a human. It would creep onto the shore from the dark waves to harm people. The region of unusually high stone walls all around the village was all to fend off the ghoul. After hours of search on the beach, we came back empty-handed. The captain suggested that we should go back to the harbor to file the missing report, and the rest happened so quickly and mysteriously before we could grasp what exactly was happening. By the time we reported to the police and came back with them to the harbor to find the captain, he and his boat were gone without a trace. We didn't know neither the name nor the exact location of the island, and without him it wasn't possible to find it. We got around on the police boat several islands in the area that could be the one we visited, but none of them had that tall stone walls. In the end, we had to come back home with an empty promise of the police that they would carry on searching. A few years later, my uncle was officially declared from missing to dead. For the past 20 years, I privately searched around for an answer, but it yielded nothing. I still sometimes have a nightmare of me wandering underneath the tall stone wall, haunted by the noise the Demon Ghoul makes. Could what I saw and heard that day be really true? Whatever happened to the island now, when its inhabitants were all shrunken elderlies 20 years ago? Might I be the only one left now who knows the island and its Demon Ghoul? Only the photo I took with my uncle on that beach keeps reminding me of what happened that day. While I was serving in the military, a newbie private was stationed in my platoon. He was a bit off, his eyes clouded and attitude limp, enough to land himself on the special watch required list. I tried to put him back on the track, and one day, as if to finally reply to my efforts, he opened up and told me this story, what happened before he came to the military. A few weeks before the military service, he and his besties planned to make a fishing trip together to a reservoir in Chechen. He grew up under a single father who worked as a shaman, and even before he talked about the fishing trip, his father said, "Don't go." Knowing what his dad is, he was shaken. But he tried to convince Dad, confiding details of the plan, that there were no real risk. But his dad simply repeated himself, not to go. For once, he could not just obey his dad. After all, it was the one last big get-together with his friends before the dreaded military service, and it had been already all planned out. He kept pleading and persuading, and in the end his dad gave in on one condition. "If anybody asks of you to do something there, never, ever grant it." He could not understand what it was supposed to mean, but he was happy enough to go ahead with the trip. So he and two friends went and settled down at the reservoir with the fishing rods and a tent on the bank. Drinks were poured from the early hours, and they all had a wonderful time. Drinks ran out by the evening, and his two friends decided to go down to the village nearby to replenish the supply, about 20 minutes' walk along the stream. Now left alone watching over the fishing rods, he felt bored and started dozing off. When he woke up, there was no sign of his friends, though more than enough time had passed already. Are they pranking? He tried to call them, but probably because it was tucked away in the countryside, he only got the messages that he could not connect. He decided to retire to the tent away from the cool breeze of the reservoir. Time was already passing midnight, and he could just anxiously fiddle with his phone in the tent. Suddenly, shadows of two people appeared over the tent. "God, it's heavy! Oi, come out and take these bottles!" They were his friends. With a relief, he exaggeratedly shouted, "What the F? Where have you been?" But before he zipped down the opening of the tent, he remembered what his father sternly told him, not to grant any wish from anybody. Feeling unsure, he mumbled, "I've got some chills. Bring them in here." "Shut up! You stayed here all cozy while we walked up and down with these. Come out now." It was definitely the voice of his friends, but something made him feel unconvinced. He made sure the opening firmly zipped up and told them once again he was staying in. "Come out now, or we'll leave you here alone." "Yeah, come out now. What the fuck is wrong with you?" The tone of the voices got gradually more threatening. If they were really his friends, they would have just opened the tent themselves and came in already. They could not be his friends. "If you want me, then come in and get me," he shouted. "Smart-ass bastard," said the voice outside between his teeth, and moved away. Confused and scared, he could not even dare to peep out of the tent. Some time passed, then shadow in the shape of a woman appeared outside. "Hello? It's so cold outside. Won't you let me in, please?" No woman should be wandering alone at this time of the day, well away from the village. "You can open it yourself from the outside," he replied with a slight bit of hope that it might be a real person. But the woman started screeching, "Let me in! Let me in! Let me in!" Shivering all over, he covered his ears. In the end, the thing outside moved away, once again saying, "Doesn't work." Time moved slowly. And then this time a shadow of a big burly man appeared. "Hello, anybody in?" Now worn out with the tension all night long, he screamed out, "Get away! Leave me alone!" But the guy outside opened up the tent and barged in. "It's the police. Excuse me, but didn't you come here with other companions?" Thank God it was a real person, and the police too. But his relief was short-lived. The officer informed him that 2 bodies of a young man were found along the stream. They were his friends. The police report was left inconclusive. The water wasn't rough, nor the height of the bank high enough to be fatal. He had to start a military service before he could see the funerals of his besties, and now he wasn't still himself. I didn't know whether to believe the story or not, but kept paying special attention to him. In the end, he was discharged, citing a medical ground. One day, in a dream, I found myself walking down the street of grey London. Everybody on the street was wearing period clothes, long skirts, hats and gloves, while when I looked down myself, I was still in my pajamas. Anyway, I ended up on the platform of a tube station which was dark and cold. My wandering steps stopped in front of a bench, and the 2 women sitting on it said their lines as if by a cue. "It was sunny in the morning, but it's now all grey again. On top of what's going on around the world these days, it makes me gloomy." All in Korean, even though they all looked local English, which I found amusing. The platform fell into silence again, with everybody there standing still, until, as if by the next cue, an old gentleman tapped his cane on the ground and said, "It feels so ominous," again in Korean. I found it so funny, so I asked the old man in English, "Can you speak English? No? Yes? Why you speak Korean?" I felt everybody's eyes turning to me, visibly shaken. Regardless, I kept pestering the old man with, "Hello? Why? Tell me." Then suddenly the 2 women on the bench repeated their lines with shaky voices. "It was sunny in the morning, but it's now all grey again. On top of what's going on around the world these days, it makes me gloomy." Followed by the old gentleman tapping his cane on the ground and saying, "It feels so ominous." Then a little boy ran down the stairs to the platform, flying some papers from his bag. "Extra news! Extra! A train is out of control and it's going to crash into this station!" he said, again in Korean, which sent the crowd on the platform all frantic. The boy came up to me too, handing over the flyer. I brazenly asked him, "Hey kid, how do you say extra in English?" I saw the eyes of the boy going trembling before turning away from me. By now I was fully aware that it was a dream, so I jumped onto the rail track and theatrically declared, "No worries everybody, I'm going to stop the train." People screamed and shouted that it was impossible, get off the track right away. But I replied, "Don't worry, it's just a dream." People all looked at me with frozen face. And then, one by one, poof, they evaporated on the spot, leaving empty clothes falling down where they stood. At the end of it, I was left alone in the dark station, in total silence. I work for an elevator maintenance department. This is a 100% true account that I experienced myself. One day I and my partner were on the way back from the final checkup for elevators in a newly finished and yet unoccupied building. Everything was fine, but before we arrived at our office, we got a call from the building management that their elevator was malfunctioning. It was almost the end of our shift, but the management was persistent, and we had to go back. So we set the elevator in question on manual mode, and I went up on the roof of the elevator cabin. From there I could manually control the movement. In the middle of the checkup, my partner had to make a pause for the call of nature, so I was just killing time fiddling my phone in the dark on the top of the cabin. Then suddenly the cabin started moving. Despite the fact it was set on the manual mode and I had a control panel with me. The only other possibility was somebody put the whole system on reset. Then the cabin would move straight all the way up before it turns to the normal working mode. In whatever case, I was upset. If I weren't idling but checking on the cables and gears at that moment, I could have got injured. But quickly I realized it was odd. The cabin was stopping at each floor, which meant it wasn't on the reset mode either. I could not even move down back in the cabin while it was constantly moving. Then I heard somebody giggle down inside the cabin. I first thought it was my partner and called his name out, but there was no reply but just giggles. A chill ran down my spine. My phone would not connect either while the cabin was moving. It must have been carrying on like that for a good half an hour, with me lost and scared in the dark. Then it finally stopped on the top floor, effectively trapping me. At least I could call my partner now, and I was waiting for him coming all the way up from the basement where he was. Then, "What you doing there?" said somebody from inside the cabin. I shouted I was checking the elevator, and whoever he was not supposed to use the elevator. There was no response, so I assumed he might have got off, but "What you doing?" he said again. "I'm working on the elevator," I shouted impatiently. "What you doing? What 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 you doing?" I was terrified. It couldn't be a sane person that I was dealing with at best. I covered my ears, but the voice was kept ringing in my ears. Finally, the elevator moved down to the 27th floor, and I jumped out as soon as it stopped. I ran down to the security office to check on the surveillance camera in the elevator cabin. I was mad and had to find out who that crazy man was. Nothing. The elevator was empty the whole time. Nothing from the camera in the hallway to the elevator either. I declared I could not work there anymore that evening, so we hopped back on in our van. And right before we drove out of its parking lot, "Bye-bye," the voice rang in my ears once again, and I fainted. When I woke up, I was in an emergency room. My partner who brought me there told me with a baffled face. He saw me shuddering all over, and then shouting, "There's another! You piece of shit! Don't touch me! I'm hungry! Don't go, Mommy! Stay and play with me!" Before I passed out. I haven't been back to work for 3 months now. Still traumatized. I went to university far away from home. I managed to get a place in the uni residence hall for the first semester, but for the following semester I had to rent a room at a private lodging. Rent in Seoul was much more than I expected, and I decided to seek a roommate to share the burden. But my small one-bedroom studio attracted no interest. Well, to be honest, who would really want to share one bed with practically a stranger? I was about to give it up when I got a message inquiring about the terms of sharing the room. The caller seemed pretty easygoing, but towards the end of the conversation, she asked an unexpected question. "By the way, would you say you have strong tea?" I wasn't even sure what she meant, as I had never thought about strong or weak tea. But in Korea, when one sleeps sound, doesn't suffer sleep paralysis or see weird paranormal stuffs, and overall has lively energy, people often comment that such a person is born with a strong chi. I guess what they mean is one was born with strong enough energy to fend off casual interference of ghosts. Well, I had never had sleep paralysis or such, and I wanted to get a roommate above all, so I just said, "Yes, I think so." Unlike what I expected from the strange question, she in person had nothing unusual or weird about her, just rather quiet. So we agreed to become roommates. As her course started a bit earlier than mine, by the time I came back to the room, she'd been there about a week already, and I was a bit shocked with the changes she made. The weather was still summery in early September, but she kept all the windows sealed shut and draped them with black curtains. Her excuse was that she hated insects and needed to be totally dark to be able to sleep. She instead offered to take up the entire electricity bill so that I could run air conditioner as much as I liked. I found it odd, but just went, "Free electricity, yay!" We never really got very close or talked much, but otherwise she was a perfect roommate. She was quiet and tidy. She agreed to my terms without a single objection. She would volunteer to take on dirty or tricky parts of a house chore, like when we got a cockroach in the bathroom. I loathe cockroaches. But since my roommate said she hated insects so much that she had to seal off windows, I was thinking how to get rid of that hideous creature. But then the roommate, hearing my initial scream, came into the bathroom, rolled up some paper and caught it. There, "That's done," she said. I was confused. Didn't she say she hated insects? But when she took care of yet another dirty task for me, I didn't have a heart to bother her with my curiosity. One day, she said she was going to be away for a couple of nights to visit her family. I asked her that if I could invite a friend to stay overnight, and she agreed. So my friend came over and stayed with me. The following morning, friend complained she could hardly sleep with sleep paralysis and whatnot, not to mention the whole room felt too stuffy with sealed windows and black curtains. She further commented, "And why do you keep standing up and wander around throughout the night? That didn't help either." "What? I slept sound the whole time. What do you mean?" I said. "No way. If it wasn't you, then what walked around like a sleepwalker all night long?" she said. I just thought either she was joking or just dreamed it all. Nevertheless, when the night came, I felt a bit spooky to be alone. Probably for the reason, unlike my usual self, I had a hard time falling asleep till about 3 in the morning. Then I heard faint footsteps. So small I had to concentrate to hear it. I opened my eyes and saw a person in the middle of the room. I had left a half-empty bag of crisps on the table, and this person was eating it. "Who are you?" I shouted. She turned her head to look at me, but didn't respond, her mouth ever busy munching away. "That's not yours," I said. "Not mine," she said, and fully turned around, revealing a knife stuck in her chest and blood all over. And I woke up. I had never suffered sleep paralysis till then, and I assumed I must have had one. I just blamed my friend for triggering silly fear in me. In the evening came back my roommate. It was a rainy day, and as she walked in, she asked me the first thing, even before she folded her dripping umbrella. "You said you had strong tea, didn't you?" "What? Yeah," was my confused reply. "Oh, good," she said, and nonchalantly went into the bathroom. Now I started finding everything suspicious about her, but could not yet summon the courage to probe her further. In bed that night, I was all nerves for the fear of having that nightmare again. You may think I was too soft, and I myself didn't think much about it during the day, but once came the night and the darkness, the fear came back with it all at once. My roommate would sleep with her face completely covered either with a duvet or her long hair, which I'd been just assuming that was because she really needed it to be completely dark to be able to sleep. But that night it just added to my anxiety. And in the middle of the night, I heard her footsteps once again. I opened my eyes to find a person standing in front of the room. She approached me, revealing her face all melted down with a severe burn and a knife stuck in the chest, blood still pouring out from the wound. She looked at me and giggled. "I found ya! I found ya!" she said, and jumped up and down, clapping her hand. Then she pulled out a knife from her chest and stabbed my chest with it. I woke up screaming and crying. It was so vivid to be just a dream, and its fear was oppressing even after I woke up. The roommate asked me what was wrong, but for some reason I didn't feel like admitting I had a nightmare. The same night terror repeated night after night. I got so paranoid that I would be startled by hearing some random hand clapping. It was a pure stress just to think of going back to my room and have another night there. Into the second week, even my friends noticed something was wrong. I confided the recurring nightmare. Most of their advices were reasonable, but useless, like take a warm shower before bed, burn a lavender-scented candle, try a sleeping pill, etc. But one of them told me, "If the ghost finds you by your face, why don't you hide your face from it?" I was desperate enough to try anything by that stage, so I went to bed with my face covered with a duvet. The dream came again, starting with the same footsteps. But this time it was wandering all around the room, and it started screaming, "Where are you? Where? Then the footsteps stopped in front of the bed, and it whispered, "Shall I open this one or that one?" Then it sang some sort of kid's ditty, clearly a version of Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo. "Yummy, yummy, Coca-Cola. Tummy aches if you drink too much. Ding dong, ding dong. Ask Doctor Know-It-All." It ended with she picking my side. The ghost flipped my side of duvet, and the dream once again ended with me being stabbed. And so it repeated a few days. I was near the end of my patience. My roommate must have seen my struggle all the while, but didn't ask a single thing. Another night, and all the accumulated frustration and exhaustion was looking for an outlet, and it directed towards the roommate. It was because of her that I could not sleep, at least with a light on. This stuffy air with sealed windows must have contributed too. When I once again woke up from the footsteps in the middle of the night and saw my roommate sleeping soundly covered with a duvet, I felt I had it enough. So I flipped over her duvet and carefully brushed her hair off of her face. I felt a bit guilty, but on the other side, I was desperate to escape the nightly ordeal this single night. So I covered myself under the duvet. Soon, the footstep approached. "I found ya! I found ya!" It jumped and clapped its hand once again, and stabbed my roommate. When I woke up and checked on my roommate next to me, she was glaring at me. "Did you have a nice dream?" she said. I was so creeped I jumped out of bed despite of myself. "Didn't you see a ghost with a knife stuck in a chest?" she asked. Yeah," I said. "Then why didn't you get stabbed by it as usual?" I was so shocked by the remark, I felt my knee giving in. I denied whatever she meant by that, but the roommate just glared up and down at me and started explaining it all, as if it was the most mundane story. The ghost was her older sister. They lost their father from a car accident. Her sister was with her dad in the car, but survived despite a burned scar on her face. Roommate and her mother blamed their sister for dad's death, no matter how unreasonable that was, and bullied her, until she committed suicide 3 years ago. She stabbed herself, piercing through the roommate's photo on her chest. And since then, the sister's ghost would appear every night. But the roommate found a solution. All she needed was a dumb roommate to get stabbed in her place. It was so unrealistic a story that I don't think I really believed it at first. "But I didn't have the dream at first," I said. "Well, didn't you say you had strong tea? But seems like you've run out of it since the day of my sister's memorial ritual," she said. When the roommate was away for a couple of nights, that must have been for the memorial ritual for her late sister. I was all goosebumps now. "How could you? You drove your sister to death and now using me as your scapegoat?" I said. She laughed out loud. "You didn't say anything, did you, when I took up all the bills and wiped after you all the while? You thought it was all free of charge." She carried on sneering at me, then suddenly with a stone face called me dumb bitch. I was so creeped that I just excused I was late for my lecture and escaped. When I came back in the evening, she was gone already with all her stuffs. Could not reach her phone either. It took a long time for me to recover from the whole ordeal. I had occasional nightmares, but to my relief the ghost didn't visit me again. When I returned to uni for the next semester, I asked around and found out the roommate had dropped out. I don't think I would ever be able to live with a roommate again. Lee Ji-ham was a scholar in 16th century Joseon dynasty. His interests were broad and flexible, unlike most other mainstream Neo-Confucius scholars, and freely delved into Taoism and mysticism. His eccentric character was so legendary that his name is associated with various rumors and stories which are most likely not true. The following story is one such. A young man had just lost his mother. He wished to find the best possible plot for her burial, but he was too poor to buy a feng shui guru's advice. So he turned to 100-day praying for help from heaven. Nearly the end of the 100th day, 2 wandering Buddhist monks came by his house. Long before the development of transportation and commercial inns, it was common that travelers seeking food and shelter by a random household on their way. So the young man offered the monks a room and went back to his praying at his backyard. "Pray, do let me come across a great master like Lee Ji-ham, and may he lend me his wisdom to find a great plot for my late mother." And what a coincidence! None other than Lee Ji-ham himself was passing by and happened to overhear the young man's mentioning his name. It triggered his interest, so he stopped by the young man's house pretending to be a traveler. "Young man, pray, I'm starving. Could you give me something to eat?" Lee Ji-ham said. The good-hearted young man wanted to serve his guests nicely, but he barely had enough to feed himself. In the end, he cooked a bowl of rice he reserved as the offering to heaven and served it to his 3 guests. Sharing this modest dinner, Ijiam chatted up the two monks.
I think our young host has lost his mother and is seeking a nice plot for her tomb. I unfortunately have no idea in that area, but perhaps you two could help him?
Yes, indeed, said one monk. As we walking down the mountain over there, we did spot a suitable plot. It will give our host in 10 years prosperity and many sons with a bright future.
In 10 years? But what about his dinner tonight?
Ijiam asked. He then called for his host and said,
I'm still starving. Stop worrying about your late mother, and I'm going to give you an advice to get rich right today. Isn't there a widow in your neighborhood?
Yes, there is one, said the young man.
Go to her and borrow some rice,
Ijiam instructed. So the young man went to the widow neighbor and asked for help. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I have 3 guests in the house tonight and I have nothing to feed them. Could you lend me some rice? Knowing the reputation of the young man as a good, kind-hearted man, the widow gladly offered him a small bag of rice. But before he could take it over, she held his hand and said, Young man, I know you are a good man. Why don't you live with me, huh? The young man was too shy, but the woman insisted, grabbing his hand even harder, and in the end, he gave his consent. Seeing his host bringing in a big bowl of steaming rice, Ijiam said with a smile,
See, you are getting married now, are you not? No more worry about what to eat every evening.
He then turned to the monks.
You sirs only learned from your books. What's the use if a fortune awaits in 10 years when you're starving right this evening? My wisdom is how to feed yourself today.
A close friend of mine told me this. Some years ago, he and 3 of his friends visited the old glasses factory. It's well known as a haunted spot in Daegu region, if not nationwide. Apparently, that particular night seemed a perfect day for such a spooky exploration. It gloomily drizzled just the right amount. On the way, they even played some low-key music on the car radio to fully immerse themselves into the experience. But as soon as the car turned a sharp corner into the narrow lane that led to the factory ground, the 2 friends at the back seat shouted to stop in unison. They both claimed that they felt lightning hunch that they shouldn't go. My friend and the other, who was sitting on the passenger seat, teased them that they were chickening out. What was all this fuss coming all the way should they turn back now? After some back and forth, they decided to push on the condition that they would turn back as soon as anything odd should occur. About 5 minutes later, they reached a small village. It was just about 7 or 8 in the evening, but strangely they could not see a single light on in any of the houses. The whole village seemed empty and silent, apart from the orange street lamps and the sound of falling raindrops. They weren't sure how to find the factory, and there wasn't anybody to ask either. Hitting a crossroad, they hopped out of the car, split themselves into 2 teams to check out the both directions. So my friend teamed up with a friend who sat on the passenger seat to take one road, and the 2 from the back seat took the other. But not long after, my friend heard one of them screaming from the other side, and soon met by the sight of the 2 friends running back down with ashen face. They jumped back on the car and urged,
Let's get out of here! Go, go, go!
They seemed so desperate that my friend and the other friend could not say anything, but turned back the car first. On the way back to Daegu town, they made a stop at a convenience store to ask what that was about. So the friends from the backseat followed one road, and soon they met a sign for Fatima Nursing Hospital, and walked further towards the direction. When they turned the corner, in the dim lamplight, they saw somebody standing. It was a slender woman with a short bob-cut hair and in a white shirt. They first just thought,
Gosh, she scared us. What's she doing there?
But soon realized something was odd. She wasn't even carrying an umbrella in the drizzling rain, and kept glaring at them. And when she opened her mouth, even though there was still significant distance between them, her voice whispered right in their ears, saying,
"You came to watch us."
The friend's throat stuck on the spot. The woman whispered again,
"Bring the other two here too."
Now totally panicked, one of them pulled the other and ran back down. As they were getting away, her voice rang right in their ears once again, but now screeching,
"Wow! So fast! So much you want to live, huh?"
Maybe it's just a lingering trauma, but one of the two still claims he hears her voice occasionally, saying,
"I know where you are. Come back with your friends."
Just a little story floating around I picked up somewhere. The guy lived with his pet cat. One day he was sleeping with his cat curled up next to him. In the middle of the night, he tossed and turned around a bit wilder than usual and unintentionally hit his cat a bit hard. Still half asleep, he nevertheless realized what he did and stroked his cat, saying,
I'm sorry.
To which the cat replied,
"It's okay."
"Oh cool, she's okay," he thought, and went back to sleep. Only in the morning when he woke up, he realized that it couldn't be. That his cat replied? Could it? I was practically raised by my grandma for the complex family issues, which I'm not going into details here. I hit my puberty a bit early when I turned 11, and rebelled and troubled my poor grandma a lot, nagging for money and even used my younger brother to squeeze pennies out of her pocket. Not a year after, Grandma unexpectedly passed away from a sudden heart attack. I was in a state of shock that I could not even shed a drop of tears for the 3-day funeral. All the relatives knew what a prick I had been to my grandma, and not so discreetly talked behind my back. How cold-blooded I was, not even looking very sad over grandma, who was more a mother than my own mom. They didn't know I was sad to death. But I was blocked up with a shock, sense of guilt, and too big a sense of regret that my young self didn't know how to deal with. One day, my grandma appeared in my dream. She hugged me and gently patted on my back and said, "It's okay, my baby. You can cry now." I woke up and broke down with a bursting cry. My dad, surprised from the sound of my bewailing, came to see what was with me. Between unstoppable tears, I managed to tell him, Granny came and said, I can cry now. I kept crying, and Dad held me a long time with the tears running down on his face too. My grandma must have seen her grandson carrying a rock in his heart since she was gone, and came back to console me. Thank you, Grandma, and I miss you so much. A story a friend told me, which he said he himself heard from a friend. So, make what you will. There lived an old man who was notorious among his neighbors for being mean and stingy. For all his greed, he seemed to have accumulated certain wealth, but lived by himself. An all-around Mr. Scrooge character. So let's call him Mr. Scrooge here. Why not? The rumor went that he lost his wife and kids from a tragic accident, but nobody was close enough to know the truth. The only friend-ish figure to him was a local real estate dealer. One day our Mr. Scrooge went to visit his office, and from the usual chit-chat with him got to learn that there was a house rumored to be haunted. Of course, nobody wanted the property. Even with the price plummeting, it remained the real estate dealer's headache for months. To his friend's surprise, Mr. Scrooge offered to buy the house. The dealer was reluctant. Considering Mr. Scrooge's character, if things should really go bad with the house, he'd have to deal with Scrooge's temper and complaints. But Mr. Scrooge insisted upon the deal, promising that he was not going to hold him accountable whatever the consequence. Soon the rumor that Mr. Scrooge bought the haunted house was talk of the neighbors. What was he up to? What should happen if the house was really haunted? Regardless, Mr. Scrooge refurbished and redecorated the house, and to everybody's surprise, he started sleeping in that house. He would still spend the day in his own home, but came to his new property to sleep every night. The next-door neighbors reported that they could hear Scrooge yelling and huffing, but nobody dared to ask him straight what was going on. A month passed. Mr. Scrooge turned up at the real estate dealer's office. He claimed the house was haunted no more and would like to put it up for rent. The dealer wasn't sure, but did as was told. Soon a family moved into a house. Everybody in the neighborhood held their breath and waited what should happen now. Nothing. The family seemed to settling well in the new place and living on without an issue. In that house where no owners or tenants had managed to stay put more than a month previously, people could not hold their curiosity anymore and asked Mr. Scrooge what he did in the house. What was all the yelling there? Mr. Scrooge explained that for that 1 month, he walked room to room every night and shouted, "Pay the rent! This house is not for free! Pay up the rent!" He never saw a ghost, nor he believed in such. But since the rumor was rampant the place being haunted, he just carried on with his nightly ritual. And one day, he had a dream in which somebody shouted back at him saying,
"Shut up! This house is mine!"
Right from the following day, Mr. Scrooge went room to room, shouting, "This is not your house! I bought it! It's mine!" He even brought the contract of the purchase with him. He waved it around and carried on shouting,
"Look at this! Here's my name and signature! Now, pay the rent!"
It carried on a few days before he got another dream. The same voice from the earlier dream shouted,
"All right, it's yours, not mine."
Mr. Scrooge took it the issue being settled and put the house for rent. Nobody could prove what he said was true or not. All they could tell was they never heard another complaint about a ghost from the family or any other subsequent tenants to the house. I usually sleep like a dead man and don't dream often. But when I do dream, it usually takes place in one of these same locations time after time. The alley to my old primary school via a stationery shop, a library with piles of books, a public toilet which seemed to belong to a school building, and a maze-like shopping mall with a big round open space in the middle. The people appearing and situations in the dream change every time, but they all take place in one of these settings, probably dozens and dozens of times. Last night, I had a dream, and I was once again back in the alleyway to my old primary school. I made a stop at the stationery shop on the way, and found a little tin jars decorated with what looked like Rudolph the reindeer. It looked like a perfect vessel to make a gift of sweets to my work colleagues, so I picked 6 of them and brought them to the cashier. The cashier then said,
"I remember you, miss."
"Really?" I said.
"You were the only one who bought the E.T. candy from here," she said.
I said I didn't know what she meant.
"Well, when you were a little girl, you bought those candies when nobody else seemed to want it,"
she said. I really don't remember. Sorry." To my reply, the cashier's face changed.
"You don't remember? How could you not? I brought you to the same place time after time just to make a chance to run into and talk to you, and you don't remember?"
I was alarmed and confused. I made an apology that it must have been many years ago, but she wouldn't have it.
"It took a long time to make this happen. God knows when I'd meet you again. Remember it all, right now!"
She came around the counter as if to catch me. Now totally scared of this mad woman, I dropped everything and jumped out of the shop. For some reason, she seemed not being able to get out of the shop. She just banged and kicked on the door of the shop, screaming. Her eyes turned glaring red, and hair all a mess as she violently shook her head in the outburst. I could just watch on with horror, when a little boy with a purple flower in his hand came up to me and said,
"Why are you back here? Told you not to. I've been trying to avoid this, but that vile woman is still chasing you. Hurry, go along."
And with that he pushed me. Next moment I was in the usual library with the piles of books. But then the boy came up to me again and said,
"Not here either,"
and pushed me once again. As the background flipping through the sad familiar settings, I woke up from the dream. I'm still confused. Who was that woman and the boy? What is this E.T. candy she was talking about. Is this really just a dream? Following is a true account of mine based on the diary I've been keeping over the years. December 26th, 2012. I had a dream so vivid that I can still remember it clearly. I was dead and was waiting for the judgment. The whole space was dark and immersed in black-red hue, and yet could still see everything clearly. There were indeed a lot of souls waiting in front of me and waiting for their turn. When a name was called out, the person would be brought out to the judge. Then came out a large screen showing the summary of the person's life, the good, the bad, and its consequences. If anybody tried to excuse their action or win a sympathy by feigning a regret, they were sternly reminded that their lives could be clearly visible because they were now nothing more than naked souls. As for the truly bad ones who caused damage and misery for lots of people, the floor opened up under their feet, which swallowed them down straight to the hell. Understandably, I was pretty nervous when my name was called out finally. So the summary of my life was shown on the screen. Surprisingly, it wasn't too bad a life, really. I almost enjoyed the opportunity to see the past moments and faces of dear people in my life once again. I definitely brought more good and help to the world than I did harm. When the screening was over, the judge said,
"Unlike how you look outside, you led a life devoid of selfishness. Your good deeds even saved a few lives on some instances."
I was relieved by the verdict. Surely I was going to the heaven.
No, that's not true. He's a real badass. God knows how many hearts he'd broken, including mine.
A woman shouted from the back. I turned around to find her, an ex-girlfriend of mine. But her claim wasn't true. We just drifted apart. What's wrong with her?
Aha! Relationship issues are private, and I usually leave it to the individuals. But if she should claim so openly as now, there should be certain share you are responsible of. But disturbing this court is also an offense, so I pronounce you both guilty.
As soon as the judge said that, the hissing and cussing woman was dragged out, and I too was shortly taken away, still dumbfounded about what just happened. Behind my back, the judge said his last word.
That girl is the karma you left in the world. Untie that knot first, and I shall see you again here.
I was thrown off into a dark pit. It soon led me to a bright light, and at the end of it, a giant picked me up by feet and spanked me at my back. "Congratulations, it's a healthy boy," the giant declared. I was soon wrapped up and laid on the bosom of an exhausted-looking woman. Looking up at her somewhat bitter smile, I suddenly realized. It's not that you hate me, but you couldn't let me go yet. And then I woke up. April 18th, 2014. My life is a bit of a hell at the moment. I have to find a new room as I could not get along with the previous roomie, that bastard. And on top of that, I have to go back to Korea for an urgent family issue. I could hire small storage to put away my things while I visit Korea, but the biggest problem was my cat. I had no friends who could take care of her, nor could I go through all the necessary paperwork to take her with me at this last minute.
But for a ray of a good luck out of all the misfortunes, a kind lady replied to my request on the community board. She would take care of my cat for no fee. God bless her. May 25th, 2014. I started dating the kind girl who took care of my cat. She's a real angel. April 12th, 2017. We finally announced our engagement to both of our parents. It's complicated with our families in Korea, but the wedding is set to take place next year, so I hope there's enough time to arrange things reasonably. February 7th, 2018. My parents told me they sought fortune tellers to check on our couple's compatibility. It's called kunghap and still common practice in Korea. Apparently, they went to see more than one fortune teller, and they all said one thing in common.
Well, they were mother and son in the previous life.
It stirred me a bit because it suddenly reminded me of my dream from years back. I got the number of one of the fortune tellers and called to tell him about the dream.
You remember only that far. I believe there was more to that. In that previous life, you died before your mother. She could not get over it, and for her longing, you two met again in this life. Your fiancée treats you so well, doesn't she, like a mother? She's doing all she couldn't do to her son in the previous life. Treat her back well. You two were destined to meet again, whether in Korea or wherever in the world.
November 10th, 2018. Despite all the usual hiccups one could expect from such an event, our wedding sailed through without any major disaster. So, I guess my dream has fulfilled itself after 6 years. After my military service, I needed to earn and save up quickly in preparation of a national certificate test. There were basically two options as I was after a high hourly pay. Either working in the production line of a factory or waiting in a bar. Well, the latter was not as honest as the first, but less physically demanding. So, yeah. The bar I worked for was a typical low-end, shady kind of place. Interior was divided into small rooms, each with a table and karaoke machine. The reason guys come to this kind of place is basically to play and be served by girls. Unlike in the old days, such a bar didn't have service women as their own staff, but outsourced them from staffing agencies. And my main job was exactly that, asking the customers what kind of girl, women they wanted in terms of age, looks and service on offer, and contact agencies to send in suitable women. Obviously, it was important for my job to be well acquainted and keep a good working relationship with these women. After a few months of work at the bar, I got quite close to a few of them. And she was not only pretty and glamorous, but also pretty articulate and sociable. I'll call her Myung for the sake of the story. I vowed myself I should separate work and personal emotions clearly. But I was a young man then, and couldn't help but casually flirt with Myung over time. One slow day, the boss decided to wrap up a bit early and had staff drink together with the service girls, including Myung. While all the others got so drunk and dozed off, we too were the last people standing, and she kissed me.
Believe it or not, it was my first kiss since I discharged from the military. And with the alcohol in my blood, I could not resist anymore. We ended in a hotel room. After sex, we had pillow talks, and out of blue, she talked about suicide. She showed her wrist, which was usually hidden under the watch or bracelets. There were at least several slash scars. Apparently, she grew up under abusive parents and ran away from home at an early age. I myself had not an easy childhood, so I could relate to her story easily. Then she took out a bottle of pills, medication for her depression, which she'd been suffering for a few years, she told me. So, since that day, we became not quite lovers, but certainly more than just work colleagues, lunching out or going to cinema together, etc. Myung was really charming, sometimes showing surprisingly naive side too, except for occasionally off moments. She often said how she loved babies and puppies, and had images of babies or puppies up on her phone too. But then one day, when we were out on the street together, we saw a little toddler walking past in his squeaky shoes. And she said, "Wouldn't you just want to rip his legs off and toss away?" I was caught by surprise by a totally unexpected comment. She quickly said, "I'm joking." Problem was, Myung dropped such uncomfortable jokes occasionally. One day we were lunching out together. She excused herself to the toilet in the middle of the meal, and she wouldn't come back for almost an hour. I got worried and asked the female staff of the restaurant to check out the ladies' room for me, but she came out with ashen face and rushed to the owner. Turned out, Myung had swallowed a whole bottle of her antidepressant in the toilet cubicle. Seeing her conversing with white forms in her mouth was shocking. She was brought to the emergency. As I had to go to work soon for the evening opening of the bar, I called Myung's roommate. A big fat woman turned up, and I asked her to call to keep me updated. After finishing the work half-heartedly, I called up Myung's roommate. I was baffled by the message that the number wasn't in service. I ran to the hospital, but Myung had left already, and she wouldn't answer my call either. I didn't know where she lived, and she didn't turn up to the staffing agency either in the following days. Myung just disappeared like that for a couple of months. One busy evening at the bar, Myung came to work. "Hey, where have you been? What's going on?" I asked.
"Huh? I'm fine. Which room should I go in?"
was her nonchalant reply. I was baffled with her acting as if nothing had happened. But that evening was really busy, so I just had to get on with my work. A couple of hours later, I ran into her again, coming out from toilet. She abruptly held on to me and bursted into tears.
"I'm pregnant," she said.
I had the shock of my young life. We had sex barely 3 times, and I made sure to use protection every time. Facing her crying, "What am I to do? My poor baby!" I had no heart to say, "But I used condom all the time." I gave her a bottle of water and told her that she didn't need to go back to the room, that I would call in another in her place. When I returned, she wasn't there. With a terrible sense of foreboding, I rushed to the ladies' room. From the inside, I could hear water at the sink running at its max. I prepared myself for the worst and slowly opened the door. There she was, in front of the mirror. Her face reflected on the mirror was almost a caricature of a mad person, with her mouth spread ear to ear and her wild eyes rolling to side to side.
Should I get rid of it? Shit. Fucking baby.
Whenever she retched, her eyeballs bulged out from her wide-opened eyes. I just quietly closed the door. I was honestly too scared to face her in that state. I just went back to my work, pretending I had seen nothing. After the business hour, I found her calmly having a smoke, cross-legged. "Still busy? I'm starving," she said. I didn't know what to say. "Shall we get something to eat when you are done?" I just wanted to run away. "Why aren't you saying anything?" I took a deep breath and finally said, "I think it's best we don't see each other again. Please don't contact me again."
You son of a bitch! What about our baby?
Myung said. I was just dumbfounded in such a cheap soap opera-worthy situation. I think I just ran away. I asked sick leave for a few days from work, and Myung didn't contact me. When I returned to work, my boss took me to a side and told me about Myung. Myung used to work in a different city. She was already notorious from there for her erratic character and bouts of depression. She also flirted with numerous waiters and staffs from the bars she worked for and said all sorts of different stories to them. That she used to be a trainee to an idol talent agency, but she could not continue because her family went bankrupt. Or that she won a jackpot from lottery and promised to start a new life. Or that she had a rare blood disease. Her story changed all the time, except that she appealed how poor girl she was and how tragic her life was. I don't know what her problem was and why she had to put on such acts, but it definitely left me more cautious and serious for the rest of the time I worked in the bar. When talking about haunted objects, most would think of dolls or jewelry and stuff like that, but what she picked up was an indoor exercise bike. Once painted white, but now all rusty and creaking, but my friend picked it up from a dumpster somewhere and was all excited about it, that she was going to exercise a lot now. Since then, her roommate heard random noises of a baby's laughter, footsteps, and creaking from the empty bike itself as if somebody was riding on it. She of course freaked out, but my friend who brought that thing in was indifferent. She obviously liked the old bike so much that she even invited other friends to show off, calling it as good as new. Her roommate had it enough though, and called me and other friend to help her to take the bike out when my friend wasn't home. So we opened the door and saw a little boy in the middle of the room. He then ran over to the bike, giggling all the way, and jumped up on its saddle. It was so unexpected a situation, we all just watched on, until the boy suddenly jumped off the bike and rushed towards us. We slammed the door and ran off, all screaming. We were now too scared even to get near the bike. We tried to persuade my friend to throw it out, that it was taking too much space in the small room, etc., but it only drove her to rage. She would rather move out with a bike. She was clearly not in her right mind. In the end, we decided to give it one more attempt to throw it out while my friend wasn't home. This time we called in her roommate's boyfriend and 2 more friends too. And God, we were surprised how effing heavy that rusty thing was. Even with 6 of us carrying it down, it clashed and slipped while bringing it down the stairs. How could then my friend, a petite woman, could carry this all the way up to her room by herself? Fearing my friend finding it and bring it back, we drove out to throw it away somewhere far away. Once it was gone, my friend didn't look for the bike at all. But when we occasionally brought out a time when she was mad about the bike, she would always remember the bike as a good as new, top-of-the-range model. I work for a kindergarten. Dealing with little kids and toddlers is my daily life. They are, of course, mostly adorable and innocent, but sometimes their naivety can come across a bit creepy. One of the kids under my care is a 5-year-old boy. He has a 1-year younger brother, and apparently seems to get lots of stress regarding his brother. You know, parents would typically reprimand the older of the siblings, saying, "You are the older, you should be big boy and be generous with your little brother," and so on. One day, this boy passed on the news that his mother had a baby in her belly. I congratulated him for a new baby sibling, but the boy said he wasn't happy about it at all. Knowing his situation already, I just smiled and told him things would turn out fine. But the boy said,
"Can't I just grab the baby and pull out of Mom's belly? Nobody would know if I threw it away somewhere. Maybe I can take my younger brother too. Well, he can walk, so maybe I have to cut his legs first."
I was dumbfounded. I knew it was innocence talking, not yet fully comprehending the right and wrong, but I can't deny it freaked me out a bit. I quietly explained why it was a wrong idea, that such an act would cause lots of pain to others, and fortunately he seemed to understand. But I sometimes do wonder and want to see how these little minds work to come up with such ideas. Back in 1985, I was in my early teens. My family home was an old-fashioned farming house with a typical layout of the main building, separate side building, and storage centering around a small courtyard. A family acquainted to my parents fell in a hard time after they lost the man of the family. My parents invited them, our mother and her son, to lodge in our side building. I got friendly with the son, who was a couple of years older than I. Let's call him Byung-jin for the sake of the story. One night we were all woken up by a scream. We all rushed out and found my dad fallen on the ground, all shivering. "What's wrong, Dad? Are you hurt?" I asked.
He was here. Byung-jin's dad, he was there, smirking at me,"
Dad said. Byung-jin's father, when he was alive, was an alcoholic and behaved weirdly, before one day fell from the bridge to his death on his drunken way back home. And now my dad saw him on his way to Privy. And from a few days after the incident, we started hearing the sound of drum and gong in the early hours of the morning from the side building where Pyeongjin lived. Our neighbors started complaining, and Mom finally confronted Pyeongjin's mother.
After my husband died, I got a call from a god. Now I've become a shaman,
was her response. Apparently she had set a shrine in our side building and was offering ritual with drum and gong every morning. It led to a big quarrel between her and my mom, and in the end, Mom asked them to move out. The real disaster happened then. I fell ill, and doctors could not diagnose what I was suffering. One feverish night, I woke up from a loud laughter ringing in my ears and saw a ball of blue flame circling around the ceiling.
"I'll take your backpack away with your life packed in it,"
said a voice in my ears, and the blue flame flew into my chest. I stood up from my bed, kicking the blanket away, and jumped around the room. Mom, who was keeping the side of ill me, tried to calm me and managed to hold me down. But that grotesque routine repeated another night and then the next. I woke up with a voice ringing in my ears.
"Your tongue shall stretch out so long that you won't be able to speak and will get strangled by your own tongue."
When I opened my eyes, indeed I saw my tongue stretched out and it dragged me around the room. I tried to pull it back to my mouth, but the tongue, like a snake, started wrapping around my neck and strangled me. Or that was what I thought I saw, while my mom later told me that I started smacking my own mouth and then stretched the lips to each side with my fingers and jumped around the room. The following night, the same voice whispered,
"Still want to live? You are going to be eaten by you. Your mouth shall swallow your own body."
My parents later told me that my eyes rolled backwards and pushed my hands into my mouth. Had they not acted promptly, something serious might have happened. In the end, my parents turned to a shaman for help.
dig up either around the chimney or the well in the backyard. You will discover something. Burn it off discreetly. That witch had grudge against you and planted a curse to your household," the shaman said. My parents rummaged around the house and found a spot under the chimney with a sign of recent disturbance. There they found a baby's rainbow sleeve shirt, and in the shirt were a bundle of needles and a talisman. My mom burnt them as the shaman instructed, and from the right next day, my strange ailment and illusion disappeared. A few years later, I tagged my mom along to the market in town. I was looking around while my mom was shopping groceries when a familiar voice called out my name. "It is you, isn't it?"
A woman approached and fumbled up my hands. It was Pyeongjin's mother.
"I've done a terrible thing to you, and deservedly punished by the god. Will you forgive me? I'm sorry,
she said. Her eyes were all hazy, clearly having lost her sight. Following story includes graphic description of violence. Viewer discretion is advised. It's already 5 years ago. I was a uni student then and worked as a part-timer at a local motel. I had to, of course, attend lectures during the day and didn't want to give up weekends to work either. So the night shift at the motel was a perfect option for me, especially considering the hourly pay was 3 times of what I would have got from working at a convenience store. The motel was located on a back street in the part of Seoul with a bustling nightlife scene. There were about 20 motels on that street alone, and they all made a good business. The owner was a tall, muscly guy with a pretty vicious look about him. I suspected he should be an ex-gang member or something, but he explained he used to be a judo wrestler. He realized his look scared clients away, so sought a part-timer to keep the front desk. Well, good for me. When I was first learning about my job there, the boss told me,
"Don't give the key to the room 603.
"Do you mean don't ever?" I said.
I mean, if there's any other room available,"
he said. That was a bit confusing instruction, but I was just a part-timer, so said, okay. Out of curiosity, I peeped into room 603 once too, but I didn't find anything unusual. A couple of months passed, and one Wednesday night, even though it was a weekday, the house was full, probably because it was pouring down in typical monsoon season fashion. A couple came in. The man seemed well over 40 and in a business suit, while the woman was much younger, probably about 25, and in t-shirt and jeans. It's not uncommon to encounter all sorts of unlikely pair-ups when you are in the motel business. Somewhat uncomfortable air, eyes avoiding to meet mine were the usual giveaway signs that it was not a proud affair. But they weren't that. I had never seen clients coming with such a dark shadow drawn in their faces as theirs. Man was so forlorn and serious, and the woman seemed she could break into tears at any second. And they both were soaking wet. Could they have really forgotten to bring an umbrella in the middle of a monsoon season? I checked if any room was available. Just one. Room 603.
"An overnight stay, please,"
said the man and handed me 50,000 won without asking the price, as if he knew it already. I debated if I should give them room 603, but having taken his money already, I just gave them the key. I took out a mop to wipe out the water they dripped behind, and then I noticed those drops were a bit too dark to be just rainwater. They seemed like blood? As I washed the mop in the toilet afterwards, the water ran indeed red. Then, a call from room 603. "Front desk here, how may I help you?" I said.
Help me.
I didn't understand clearly at first, as she whispered as if she was making a secret call. She carried on with a desperate tone.
Help me. He's gonna kill me. Save me, please.
What the F was going on? On top of the drops of blood I had just wiped out, chills ran down my spine. But before I could respond anything, the line went dead. I was stuck there for a few seconds, but quickly rang an emergency line and explained the situation. They said they'd send police in 5 minutes. 5 minutes, when a woman was about to be killed any second now. I was still young, naive, and so braver. I picked up the mop for a weapon and went up to 6th floor. Through the hallway to room 603 were drips of watermarks, looking bloody as before. I put my ear to the room door. The door was thin enough for me to hear noises from the other side. Loud noises from the TV and, In between those, muted thumping sound, as if somebody was stabbing something repeatedly. I tightened my grip of the mop and opened the door with a master key, quietly. The light was off in the room, but still bright enough from the TV screen. And in that flashing light I saw the man sitting on top of the woman. He was holding something with both of his hands, and struck down the woman's chest with it time after time. What he was holding was a knife. The whole bed was already soaked in scarlet, and the woman didn't move at all, seemingly already dead. The man finally stopped his almost mechanical stabbing motion and turned to look at me. His eyes were gleaming white with madness. Well, guess I was mad enough by then too, and rather than running away, I yelled, "You bastard!" I walked in with a mop aiming forwards. The man jumped off the bed and ran to the bathroom. There was no lock on bathroom doors in that motel, so I kicked the door with my might, shrieking like an animal. The door banged to the wall loudly. But there was nobody in the bathroom. I turned on the light and looked around, but he wasn't there. There was no window, and the ventilation hole was not bigger than my hand. I checked the bathroom behind the door and even flipped a towel that was hanging. But there was nobody. What the? But I remembered the woman and hurried out of the bathroom. And she wasn't there either. The bed was still stained with scarlet blood, but the woman was gone. My hand must have gone limp despite of myself. I just heard a loud clash of the mop hitting the floor. Have I gone mad? Was I hallucinating? But look at that all the blood. I poked the blood-soaked mattress to make sure it wasn't hallucination. My finger became tainted red indeed. To my ears, suddenly the sound from the TV rang strangely clearly. It was a news report.
Huge crowd climbed mountains to enjoy the red and yellow autumn colors.
Autumn colors? But it was in the middle of summer monsoon season. Before I could think anything further, I heard a rattling noise from the bathroom. I turned to look inside. The man was there, looking into the mirror. His suit was soaked with blood, and both his hand and the knife he was holding were dripping with blood too. His face, looking at his own reflection, was that of a devastation. Then he slowly lifted the knife to his throat. His eyes rolled and met my reflection on the mirror. His hand stopped for a second to give me a faint smile, and slashed himself. Blood shot out like a fountain, and the man fell on his knees. Thank God I finally fainted at that point. I was woken up by the police I called in. They went straight up to the room 603, having found the front desk empty, and found me there, unconscious. I asked the police and asked again if there wasn't anybody in the room, a woman of such and such look, and a man of such character. But they confirmed there wasn't anything. No woman, no man, and no blood-soaked bed. No light was on in the room, the TV was off. Just me fainted, and the mop fallen next to me. Except for the dark reddish stain on my finger. The police left, and I spent the rest of my shift crouched behind the desk. I called my boss in the morning and just said I could not work for him anymore. He kept silent a while and said,
"So, you saw it there too?"
He later explained to me 4 years ago, A man in his 40s killed a woman in his 20s, and then killed himself by slashing his throat. The man was married and they were having a secret affair, but when the woman decided to leave him, he wasn't willing to let her go. He dragged her to the motel by threat and force and killed both of them in room 603. Boss consoled me with extra pay and in later days called in a shaman to perform a ritual in the room too. And well, I stayed there. It wasn't easy to find so easy and well-paid work after all. Just under one condition: that room 603 should never ever be offered to anybody. A few days ago, I was invited to the wedding of my mate from high school. We are not exactly close friends. Well, to be honest, we hadn't met since graduation, but it was an occasion to celebrate and also meet other high school mates, so I gladly attended the event. Indeed, there were lots of familiar faces, and we were spending a jolly good time into the late night at the reception. When the newlyweds joined our table, we of course couldn't miss throwing the usual questions like how they first met. Apparently they met as a recruiter and a recruitee when my friend was struggling to find a job and survive in the jungle that was Seoul. That was already 7 years ago, and those years leading to the marriage was not all smooth sailing. They both had quite a strong characters, and the clash led to several breakups and reconciliations. Well, so far nothing too unusual for a long-term couple. Then, when they broke up for the last time, it was indeed very serious. Normally, one of them would have made a first move to patch up, but this time there was no contacts at all for a couple of months. My friend thought it was all over and spent days on alcohol. But life carried on, and one day he had to work into late night and was on the way home. In the metro train well past the rush hour were lots of empty seats, but he somehow felt like standing and was looking out the night view outside with the earbuds in for his usual playlist of music. Suddenly he heard some noise. It sounded like somebody sobbing. It clearly wasn't a part of music that he'd been listening to hundreds of times. To be able to hear through the noise-cancelling earbuds, it must have been quite a loud sobbing, but he could not see anybody crying in the train. Passengers sparsely occupying seats were either dozing away or fiddling with their phones. He shrugged and turned his eyes to the window again, but he heard the same sobbing again. He looked around one more time, but everything was calm and usual in the train. Somewhat alarmed, he turned down the volume of the music and listened out for the source of the noise. Silence. Was it a hallucination or what? He was about to give up and turn up the music again. It was clearer than before. He was all goosebumps now and looked up startled. And in the reflection on the window was the back of a woman with a long hair, crying in a white mourning dress. He screamed despite of himself. It was so much more shocking because he was caught off guard. Everybody in the train looked at him funny for his scream. Now more embarrassed than scared, he got off as soon as the door opened at the next station. He realized it was the very station he used to see his girlfriend off countless times. Next moment he was dialing her despite of himself.
Hello.
Her voice answering the phone was half drowned in tears. And only then he realized why the mystery sobbing earlier in the train bothered him so much, because It sounded so familiar, because it was the voice of his girlfriend.
What's wrong?
Was his instinctive reaction.
My dad. He's dead.
He ran straight to the funeral home and was once again shocked to see his girlfriend in her white mourning dress. She happened to have her long hair down when he walked into the funeral home, and it looked exactly like the reflection of the woman he saw in the train. The girlfriend's father had suffered a chronic health issue, which suddenly got much worse about a month after their breakup, and he passed away in the afternoon of the very that day. I guess they were really meant to stay together. Some human connections are sometimes spookily strong, I find. In the winter of my freshman year, I went backpacking to Europe, my long-held goal on wish list finally checked. I had worked real hard for a full scholarship because my parents promised to finance the trip should I get the scholarship. It was my first trip overseas, and despite of my research before the trip, I came across quite a few unforeseen hiccups and troubles. Nevertheless, I saw and did as much as I could, staying on the budget, until the last day of the trip. I reviewed the numerous photos I made on the journey and suddenly realized I didn't have many shots of myself. And while visiting an 800-year-old church, I did what I shouldn't have done. I scribbled my name and date on the wall of the church and took a selfie against the scribble as a background. I know, terribly childish vandalism, but trust me, I ended up paying for my wrong. Upon returning to Korea, I was ill and bedridden for a few days. Fortunately, it got better after 3 days, and I just assumed it might have been a bad flu. But even afterwards, I suffered strange chills or sudden panic attacks, together with frequent sleep paralysis. What I saw during the paralysis was not like anything usual. I would find myself not in my bed, but tied to a wooden pole upside down, like the hanged man in tarot cards. Then, probably finding it curious to see me in such a position, people started coming up to me. And these people were not living humans. They were clearly spirits in all sorts of gory, grotesque forms. But what terrified me the most was neither their bloody faces nor their crazy cackle, but that something was cutting off their heads. Their heads were decapitated in a lightning speed, followed by their curious eyes and sneering smile, turning into a terrible scream and confused eyes. Such night terror continued for days, and I had a hard time carrying on with my daily tasks. Out of blue, I remembered when I accompanied Mom to shaman shortly before my SAT. The shaman assured me then, on top of the strong body and mind I was born with, there were several guardian angels protecting me. I don't know why my thought reached the memory, but I think I already knew my problem had a more spiritual basis than physical one. And right that night, I finally saw who the decapitator was. In the middle of the night, my eyes opened, and despite of myself, I stood up from bed and looked out of the balcony. I didn't feel like looking out, but my body just moved on its own will. The familiar view over the apartment block was under the thin veil of fog, and in the haze, something appeared. A figure riding on a horse. It was nothing like I'd seen or even imagined. My knees gave in and I dropped on the floor, but still had to watch on. The rider was mercilessly cutting off the heads of spirits around, regardless of man, woman, young or old. The eyes of a young woman with a pale blue face on the run from the massacre happened to meet mine. She screamed for help. But what could I do? Heck, I could not even think, and just saw her head falling down and rolling away on the ground. And then I saw the rider lifting his huge sword and pointing it towards me. He was far away from me, but I felt as if the point of the sword was right up to my throat, that it was just a second away from when my head too should fall on the ground. When I woke up, I could not stop shaking. I tried to convince myself that it was just a dream, just a messed up images from, I don't know, films I watched in the past. But I could not deny the sense of impending doom. I ran to my parents and talked about everything I experienced and saw like a madman. Fortunately, my parents took my desperate pleas seriously and took me to the shaman I mentioned earlier. I never really believed in paranormals or spiritual world till then, but the series of things I experienced the next just overwhelmed me. As soon as the taxi arrived at the shaman's place, I was gripped by a deathly chill that made me almost breathless, followed by a deafening scream right in my ears. I asked Mom if she too heard it, but she only shook her head with wide eyes. As soon as I walked into the shaman's place, she ran out to me. She held my both hands, shuddering all over, and yelled, "Why is the monster following you? Where have you been? What have you done that the Western ghost is following you?" Tears started pouring out from my eyes with an inexplicable sense of guilt. I started talking in every detail about how I vandalized an old church in Europe, something I hadn't even thinking about to that point. The shaman listened intensely with all the dramatic reactions and declared that I should join the military as soon as possible if I was to save myself and other souls. Seeking a protection under a martial establishment with generals and arms was the only way to scare away this rider from Europe and his army of death, massacring all the spirits around and even my guardian angels. So I applied for military service for the soonest date available. I could not dare to go out till the day of enlistment. Upon the advice of the shaman, I even bought a pair of changseng, the traditional totem of protection, and put them in the hallway. And I do believe the totems did protect me, as they were both found split clean in half on the day of my enlistment. My mother ran a hair salon when I was young. Business wasn't great, maybe her skill wasn't great. There was only sporadic flow of clients at best, and Mom was often away to chat away with the owners of other shops on the street. I was in charge to hang around in the shop watching TV and to call Mom in when a client should come. One early evening, it must have been well before 7 as Dad wasn't back home from work yet. My younger brother was sleeping in the back room adjacent to the shop, and I was, as usual, watching my favorite anime on TV, reenacting the moves of its characters. The sliding door of the shop opened. There was a man in a white shirt, black trousers. Overall, he looked ordinary and harmless, but I got an odd vibe. His hair looked still too short to seek a cut or a perm, and the newspaper rolled up under his armpit. "Hello, sir," I greeted regardless. The guy smiled and asked,
"Hi, is your mom in?"
I couldn't remember ever seeing his face around in this small town, and his eyes? Even while talking to me with a smile, his eyes were rolling busily around the shop. I thought to run out and fetch Mom, but I was worried about brother sleeping in the room too. So I shouted towards the back room.
Dad, there's a client. I'm gonna go and fetch Mom in.
The man stopped me from going out and said,
"Oh, don't worry. I'll come back later,"
and went away. I locked the shop door behind him and spied the outside anxiously, waiting for Mom. She came back not long after, but didn't seem to pay much attention to my story about this strange man earlier. I was a bit miffed, so retreated to the back room and opened my homeworks. Then loud sirens rang right outside on our street. Mom went out to see what was happening, and I quickly joined. There were a whole team of police cars, ambulances, and a crowd of people in front of the video rental shop just a few shops down from us. The details we learned only next day. Apparently the rental shop was robbed, and the owner of the shop, a middle-aged woman and one of my mom's usual chit-chat buddies, was stabbed to death. Her son was also present in the shop at the time, but the murder took place while he was gone upstairs to have dinner. Upon learning the details, Mom took me to the police station.
That murderer was at my shop too, while my daughter was keeping the shop alone.
He apparently took a round tour to the shops on the street, and other people's description indeed matched what I saw. On the way back from the police, Mom asked me,
"How did you come up with an idea to pretend Dad was home?"
"I don't know. I just felt it dangerous," was my answer. Mom kept her business for another 5 years there, but the murderer was not caught to the end. In 2004, I just finished the military service and found a job in a small security company. I was usually sent off to various events to keep the crowd in order. Fresh out from the military, I worked hard, and probably for the reason I was soon promoted to the position of a team leader. At the time, I lived in the southern city of Ulsan. Its Grand Park had just opened, and as its first major event, they organized a circus show. In the airdome tent were some animals like a baby bear, American raccoon, and so on the show, and the acrobat team from China performed. And I was in the charge of the security there. 2 part-timers took charge during the day, and I took over for nights from 8 in the evening to 8 in the morning. The work was easy. The construction of various infrastructures in the park was still going on, and the park was closed to the public at night. So all I had to do was to check if the animals were doing fine and make sure the event facilities were in place. Into the second week on the duty, I finished checking around inside the air dome and was on my way to check the stable for horses that were part of the acrobatic show. I heard from afar some metallic creaking noise, like from a swing. I figured out it was from the hilly side of the park, and to my knowledge there was no playground in that part of the park. I wondered, but didn't want to climb up the hill in the dead of the night, so I just checked on the horses and went back to my office. Following day, I asked the park management, and indeed was confirmed that there was no facility in the hillside. I felt a bit spooked, but rationalized it might have been from a factory in the area, as Ulsan is an industrial town after all. But the same noise returned every night. Maybe it was my imagination, but it even seemed to be getting closer by day. My patrol to the horse stable got shorter and shorter because I felt gradually uncomfortable. Then one night, The same noise was heard again on my way to the stable, except it was much closer this time. I still wanted to believe there must be a rational source of the sound. Some teenagers must have sneaked in and were playing a prank, I thought. It must be. It had to be. I took the pepper spray gun out and shouted to the direction of the noise. "Stop fooling around and come out!" Regardless, the creaking noise continued and got louder. Soon I became sure it was coming from within the range of my sight, and then the sound started coming from other directions too, from left and right, east and west, all around me. I was frozen there with a panic, still holding out the gas gun in an awkward position. I decided to run back to my office. I would run at 3, 1, 2. The noise disappeared all at once. You know what? The sudden silence was even more terrifying. I could not move or think. I was just shivering, glaring at the bush from where the creaking noise was last heard. The noise rang right in my ears. My legs gave in and I collapsed on the ground. Only a few seconds later I could shake myself up and ran to the office. I hid myself there till the dawn broke. I searched around in the morning, but I could not find any sign of an intruder. I reported what happened to my boss, but he didn't take it seriously at all and turned down my plea for a partner on the night shift. I could not quit right away for having the title of a team leader, but stayed in the office for the rest of my time on duty in the park. And that was the last job by the security company, needless to say. Hi, it's Anthony here, and thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed revisiting these stories, or perhaps discovering what you might have missed. The emotional life as a small YouTuber is a bit of a roller coaster, I must say. I jump with joy when there's a single new subscriber, and feel distressed in equal measure when I lose one. At least it is on the growing trajectory overall, so fingers crossed. If you enjoy my work, please help me beat the monster that is YouTube algorithm by leaving me a comment and thumbs up, and of course by subscribing to my channel. If you loved it so much that you consider a bit more direct support, I also have a Buy Me a Coffee account. The link's in the description. Thank you all, and I hope you join the journey together. I'll give myself a week off and come back with an all-fresh new episode Sunday in 2 weeks. Until then, stay safe and take care.